Yeah. So do I? Yes. So thank you all for getting back in your seats. So I'm gonna get started. Firstly, I'd like to thank Paola and her curatorial team for inviting me to be a part of this Triennale symposium, Broken Nature. I will confess that I hesitated to accept the invitation at first because one, I didn't know what the term restorative design meant. And as an appointed official of a city like Detroit, I couldn't imagine coming to New York and at the Museum of Modern Art to talk about restorative design without talking about restoration of public trust in municipal government, for example, or without talking about the restoration of the spirit of Detroit, where ordinary residents are solving some of America's most intractable problems and challenges in an American city, or without talking about the restoration of trust that design can be used as a vehicle to talk about something other than aesthetics, but also to talk about health and social well-being. So I think after a bit of reading up and watching a few YouTube videos of Paola, I realized that Detroit actually might be at the vanguard of implementing restorative design, and in fact is in many ways redefining the American city. So I accepted, but I told her I'd have to do it in the context which is uniquely Detroit, which begins with Motown. So some of you may remember Marvin Gaye's hit Mercy, Mercy Me, but many of you may not realize its alias, AKA The Ecology. He penned this piece in 1971 in Detroit when Marvin Gaye was trying to help Motown transition from its upbeat, happy Motown sound into a sound that was socially conscious and could speak to big, complex issues. So the ecology became the rallying call, kind of a national anthem to the awakening environmental movement, a movement and a song that was lamenting the damage that had been done by the over-industrialization of our planet, by pollutants polluting the air and the water, by the collapse of an industrial economy that left tens of thousands of people unemployed, and wreak havoc over the physical environment where stoic mansions looked out as silent witnesses to the decay and the degradation of the built environment. And in Detroit, tens of thousands of houses were left as hundreds of thousands of people left the city over a 50-year period, and leaving in its wake a unnatural condition where nature had been developed, and so there's nothing natural about what was left in the absence of buildings, and got to the point of breaking when in 2012, a national paper said, would the last person out of Detroit please turn off the lights? Oh, wait, it's too late. So we participated in a national pastime of envisioning a great American city that was actually going to die in our lifetime. And so this was the point of breaking. And it's known now as the Great Municipal Bankruptcy of 2013, the largest American city to ever go through a structured bankruptcy. And today we're 5 years post, and a number of things came into being during this process. In 2014, an incredible mayor was elected, Mayor Duggan, who said, "Give us 6 months before you leave." Now, in 2014, from 2004 to 2014, 244,000 people chose to leave the city. And on his inauguration, 1,000 people were leaving a month. And he pleaded to allow us the opportunity to try to right what was wrong about Detroit. And the history of this moment, where you had $18 billion in debt, you had a loss of over 63% of the urban population, 1.2 million, over a half a century, poverty rate at 36%. And you can see just the litany of social, economic, and environmental ills that plague the city. So we are 5 years post-bankruptcy, have passed a balanced budget ever since, and are no longer under federal financial oversight. And so the buses are running, the ambulances are running, the lights come on at night. It's starting to rebuild the basic notion of a municipal trust that government can get things done. And so now we get to ask the question, what kind of city do we want to be? We are guided by a very simple premise that means a lot to Detroiters. The concept of building one city for all of us. Now you have to understand Detroit is the largest majority African American city in America, and to pivot from Detroit versus everyone to Detroit welcomes everyone is a renewal which is underway. And it's based on a simple notion that we don't think has been achieved yet in an American city, that we can rebuild the city, we can grow without displacement. So the 680,000 people who chose to remain and not abandon their city are at the center of how the city is being rebuilt. These are folks who made a choice through the good times and the bad, mostly bad, to stick it out with a city that they love dearly, who have very long tenures in their neighborhoods, 40, 50, 60 years. And they are living in neighborhoods that look like this, of which there are dozens and dozens. So despite the dystopian view of what life in Detroit looks like, I can assure you there are parts of it that are extraordinarily healthy and that aren't broken. So the question for us is, so what does restorative design mean in Detroit, in the context of Detroit? Well, for us, we talk about health and we talk about beauty, which is something that Detroiters weren't allowed to talk about for many, many years. We talk about growing, but growing inclusively, in which economic opportunity is laced into all of the strategies. And we talk about the reality of having to do this work and using the work to build trust in our ability to change the reality that we're living in. So it means going beyond inclusion. and allowing those citizens who stuck it out to drive the planning process. For me, this is a part of my core belief system, and I was a part of a group of public interest designers over 10 years ago who founded the principle of seed. This notion that every citizen has a democratic right to live in a socially, environmentally, and economically and environmentally well-designed community. That the process of design is effectively a democratic one, where you mobilize people to tackle really tough issues, and that collective process of problem solving by giving the work directly back to people who are affected by it builds up a sense of resiliency and unleashes a level of creativity that can answer to the kind of intractable problems that face a city like Detroit. So that, for us, means meeting communities where they are, in the backyards of community leaders, in the very neighborhoods that we are trying to restore. It means creating new ways to engage people that are interactive, so you don't just tell them or show them, you engage them in the transformation of what it might mean to create a cycleway or pedestrian crossing in their neighborhood. It's also about putting design at the center of the conversation and helping it become a part of the everyday conversation about urban life. And so I've often wondered, how can you engender a sense of a value in design if you're not talking about it every day? And the idea of design as something not for an exclusive few, but designed for all. So Detroit is big. It's so big you can fit the city of San Francisco and Boston in it, and the island of Manhattan within our 139 square miles. It also has the largest landholding, publicly held landholding of any city in America. 24 square miles of land is now under a single authority. So the areas you see here that are green are the most populated areas of the city, and the areas in yellow and red have varying percentages of vacancy, the deepest red being the most vacant. And this is what it looks like. So there's no 100% vacancy and no 100% occupancy. It's a gradation, it's a quilt, it's a tapestry of people inhabiting the land, and the land that was developed returning to nature. And there's something incredibly empowering about this image, because this doesn't look broken. It looks like nature regenerating itself, and people still populating that space. But there are lots and lots and lots of places in Detroit that look like this. Over 72,000 parcels are under public ownership. And so the question is, how do you maintain 24 square miles of vacant land and the millions of dollars that go into mowing it and maintaining it to a level that citizens feel it's curated or cared for? So that's a municipal responsibility. A far more powerful response is when citizens take it upon themselves to become the stewards of that land, whether it's through community gardens or eyes on the street. Detroiters have been caring for the landscape for decades when the municipal government had no capacity to do it. And so Ms. McClinton would get on her power mower on weekends and mow her block And so the question is, how do you make Ms. McClinton an investor, an equity investor in the recovery of her neighborhood? And to do that, you have to pivot from land being the noose around Detroit's neck to it being the competitive advantage that this city has over any other city in America. When you control land, you control the future of your city. Now, how you do that with citizens at the center, I want to show 5 projects, 2 which are comprehensive citywide, which try to restore nature in various fashions, but that belong to everyone. And then the particular set of typologies that are emerging that are neighborhood-based and very much ground up. So you're looking at the Detroit River, the border with Canada, the international border with Canada. And the assignment that I was given, one of my first assignments, was to create a comprehensive framework that would assure that the riverfront would remain public in perpetuity. And so over the course of 10 years prior to my arrival, Detroit, through the Riverfront Conservancy, reclaimed the riverfront, creating a multi-mile promenade, taking a derelict industrial riverfront and creating a wetland demonstration that was in many ways just a little pilot. But when I got there, the next large parcels were being determined, and they were all up for development. So the notion that the last remaining parcels along what would be a multi-acre park was up for bid to the highest bidder for private gated condominiums was what I inherited. And we had to change that conversation. And so the best way to change that conversation is to invite the public into it. And we did that. In a way, we would have to satisfy a broad constituency from the woman who's going to the pier to fish, to the woman who's taking her office break walk with her latte, and to understand whether we could repropose an ecology that was genuinely a river ecology. And so Michel Devine, the Parisian landscape architect and SOM, won the commission to envision this process. And it was one of trying to heighten the pre-development phase of the riverfront by simply remembering that rivers flowed to the river, and the idea of open space being a recognition of that history. And then development, not stymieing development, but directing the development towards an urban boulevard that could be supported by transit, and that did not build condominium towers at the water's edge. And so these are the images that Detroiters chose as the type of wetland garden at the river's edge, along with a promenade that would extend for 5 miles. And not at the expense of development, but development being pushed to its edges, creating an urban fabric defined by this new ecology, but that managed all of the stormwater of future development. And it was hailed as a victory for a democratic vision of what a riverfront for everyone would look like. And this notion of heightened urbanity meeting a natural system and the natural system leapfrogging over the urban edge is the vision that we have moving forward, and that's being refined today as we speak. The other was to acknowledge the veins and former river paths that led to the Detroit River that over time have morphed into informal pathways that connect neighborhoods that are just north of the river. And you can see the Quindra Cut, which has already been realized, and the proposal of two others. The DeQuindra Cut is thought to be the first part of a 26-mile loop that would connect the northernmost portion of Detroit to the river through an off-road greenway system. This was the DeQuindra Cut 10 years ago, and as it is today. And it is about 25 feet below the street level, and is one of the most beloved 3-mile stretches of the city. And so our notion was, can this idea help bolster the evolution of bike culture in the Motor City? And more importantly, could it help us create value along the adjacent lines of the Greenway? But the idea of greenways as gentrifiers, as they increase property values, has to be understood in the context of Detroit's demographics. As you can see from the purple map, the majority of this greenway goes through neighborhoods where the household income is under $27,500. And the greenway goes through neighborhoods in the orange map that where 30% of residents don't have a vehicle, which means a greenway is a path to equity in Detroit. And to assure that long-term inclusion and affordability of this, if you look at the green map, you'll see the vast majority of land which is publicly owned, which allows Detroit to control the future of property as this greenway does what we imagine it will do, energize that neighborhood. And so the DeQuindra Cut as we see it today and the neighborhoods it would connect, and the second part, which is a 7-mile, a former rail line, which already has a native ecology in place, and how you heighten this and make it a part of one's everyday experience of going to work. This project also is under design for the entire 26 miles. So the hope is that this asset will drive the revitalization along its borders. And we're already beginning to see the first ground-up project that imagines housing, retail, and most importantly, public space and services made along the cut at Eastern Market. But if the heart of this recovery is in its downtown and on its riverfront, I would argue that the soul of the recovery is in the neighborhoods. And to that effect, excuse me. Okay. So we have identified most of the areas in Detroit that have the highest residential concentration. And all of the blue you see there is vacant land. And what emerges is the landscape is the connective tissue of these higher density areas. And so we worked very specifically on this notion of a landscape archipelago, where these areas of density, gentle density that can coexist with single family houses is where a coordinated investment would go, but not specifically new construction, where the landscapes will lead. And our team of about 36 architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and city planners map these strategies and put them out for public RFP, and have been able to attract some of the best talent and best landscape thinkers in the country and around the world to look at this issue of the land resource that Detroit has in neighborhoods. And so I obviously don't have time to go into depth on the strategies that are emerging, but I'm going to take a moment to talk about the homes and gardens of Fitzgerald. I'll talk about the linear stormwater tree gardens of Eastern Market. But at this point, we've arrived at 6 strategies, 6 of 10. Each of them are individual, that are place-based and authentic to that neighborhood. Each of them are the product of months and months of work with citizens to look at how neighborhood restoration through the landscape will occur. So starting with the tree nurseries of Rosa Parks, it was designed by Walter Hood and my landscape colleague, Dan Reedon. And it was at the center of where the '67 rebellion in Detroit occurred that decimated that particular community, wiped away the 12th Street and many, many of the residential homes there, leaving about 40 acres of vacant land. So in Detroit, that means we will have a conversation about history, about race, and about how we build within this an economic opportunity. It was very much at the center of people's thoughts. And the answer that we came up with was the idea of a commercial or a community nonprofit nursery. So it's a productive landscape that fills in all of the acres of vacancy in that neighborhood through a set of typologies that, when put together, create a working kind of garden center in the neighborhood that rehabs the houses and creates public space that's laced through a typical block. So a block that looks like this in the vision of restoring that landscape would be a place of commerce, but that would also allow for public space to be made. The second is the linear stormwater garden authored by Michael van Valkenburg and Hugh Teal. And it's adjacent to one of the largest urban farmers markets in the country, Eastern Market. And just across the DeQuinta Cut is acres and acres of formerly residential property. And so as these businesses sought to find new and improved facilities in a desire to keep them in the city, we had to begin to understand how you transition a formerly residential area into a food industry area that allows every individual family to stay in place. And this too is the result of months of conversation with residents about how a performative landscape can manage the stormwater on these large plate industries, and how a neighborhood, a 8-block area that you see with black houses, could retain the stormwater from the development and create an identity for that neighborhood that is fundamentally wet. And so an area like this would become a wetland garden. And what was fascinating is to watch residents embrace the wettest of the strategies as a part of their identity, and taking big plate industry and juxtaposing it to live-work businesses that would support entrepreneurship is what you're seeing in this image. And the last one that I'll talk about is Home and Gardens of Fitzgerald. It's actually the first project that we started with, so it's fully under implementation, designed by Spackman Mossop Michaels, the Australian landscape architecture firm, with our own landscape architect, Alexa Bush. And the idea is very simple. Go into a quarter-square-mile neighborhood, renovate every single house, and plant 200 gardens, and build a new central park. The challenge here was to take the restoration of homes and tie it to the restoration of land. So for every house that gets renovated, the developer commits to building a flowering meadow garden as a part and extension of the house domain. And the houses, of which there are 100, this is an area where the average family household income is $30,000. 200 gardens will be planted, many of them productive, and you're seeing the typology of garden plots that are proposed. This project took about 28 community meetings, about 50 block club contacts, and a host of demonstration pop-up events in order to persuade residents that we could go into a neighborhood, renovate 20 acres of vacant land, build nothing, and restore their neighborhood. At the core of it is a park, the first effort to create a multi-acre park out of residual parcels that happen to be aggregated at the center of the neighborhood. Could we create a vision of a park across alleys and across streets, where this park would be more than a park? It would be the connective tissue, and it would be the center of regeneration in this neighborhood. A place where young teenage boys are invited to play full-court basketball, and young kids have a one-of-a-kind, unique playscape in their backyards. And this was inaugurated this summer and did everything we'd hope it would do in terms of neighborhood identity and solidifying that you can create place after this discarded pattern and tapestry of vacant lots. So for me, in conclusion, the idea of using design to restore physical beauty to a degraded landscape in the everyday places where neighborhoods, where neighbors live, is at the core of the transformation that's underway in Detroit. Restorative design implies a healing of the human spirit that requires a very different and heightened level of compassion and, yes, empathy and understanding of the lived experiences of residents who have lived through trauma, but came through it with a greater resolve and are planning. They are planning to stay, and they're engaged in the delight and the beauty of creating something new in the very spirit of Detroit. Thank you very much.